My father threatened to cut me from his will unless I married his choice. I showed him that his money meant nothing to me. My father, Reginald, controlled everything in our family with money. He inherited a significant fortune from his mother and used it like a weapon his entire life. He decided where we lived based on what neighborhoods impressed his friends. He decided what schools we attended based on whose children went there. He decided what careers we pursued based on what sounded prestigious at dinner parties. Every major decision in my life had to pass through his approval or face the threat of financial consequences. Growing up, I didn't realize this was unusual. I thought all fathers held money over their children's heads. I thought phrases like, "You'll get nothing when I die," were normal parts of family conversations. I thought love and inheritance were the same thing. By the time I understood how twisted this was, I was already deep in the cycle of trying to earn his approval. I became a lawyer because he wanted a lawyer in the family. I dated people he approved of because he threatened to stop paying my student loans if I didn't. I attended events I hated and smiled at people I couldn't stand because he reminded me constantly that my future comfort depended on staying in his good graces. My younger sister figured out the game earlier than I did. She rebelled at 17 and moved across the country at 18. My father cut her off completely and told everyone she was dead to him. He changed his will publicly and made sure the whole family knew she would receive nothing. He used her as an example of what happened when children disobeyed. I watched and learned to stay quiet. Then I met someone my father didn't choose. Her name was Faye, and she worked as a carpenter. She built custom furniture for wealthy clients and made a decent living doing work she genuinely loved. We met at a coffee shop when she complimented the book I was reading. We talked for 2 hours, and I gave her my number without thinking about what my father would say. For the first 6 months, I kept Faye's secret. I told my father I was too busy with work to date. I saw her on weekends and pretended I was visiting friends. I fell in love while lying to everyone about it. Eventually, my father found out because he always found out. He had friends everywhere who reported back to him. Someone saw me with Faye at a restaurant and described her as working class. My father called me immediately demanding an explanation. I told him the truth. I said I'd been dating someone for 6 months and I was happy. He asked what she did for a living. I told him. He said absolutely not. He said I would end things immediately or face consequences. He said he had someone better in mind for me. Her name was Lauren, and she was the daughter of one of his wealthy friends. She worked in finance and came from old money and looked exactly like the kind of wife my father could brag about. He'd been planning this match for years, apparently. He just hadn't told me until now. I said I wasn't interested in Lauren. I said I was in love with Faye. He said love was irrelevant and financial security was what mattered. He said Faye could never provide the life I deserved. He said if I didn't end things and give Lauren a chance, he would remove me from his will entirely. I would get nothing. Not the house, not the investments, not the watches, not any of it. I would be as dead to him as my sister was. I asked for time to think. He gave me 2 weeks. During those 2 weeks, I did a lot of thinking, but not about what he expected. I thought about my sister, who had been cut off for years and somehow survived. I thought about Faye, who built beautiful things with her hands and never once asked about my family's money. I thought about myself and the person I had become, trying to please a man who only loved me conditionally. I thought about what I actually wanted from life versus what my father had decided I should want. At the end of 2 weeks, I called my father. I told him I chose Faye. He said he was disappointed but not surprised. He said I was making the biggest mistake of my life. He said he would have his lawyer change the will by the end of the week. He said I should remember this moment when I was struggling in a few years while Lauren's husband lived comfortably. Then he hung up. I expected to feel devastated. Instead, I felt free. The threat he had held over me my entire life finally landed, and I was still standing. He had no more power over me because he had used his only weapon. I couldn't be threatened with something that had already happened. I threw myself into building a life that didn't depend on his money. I worked harder at my law firm and got promoted twice in 3 years. And I moved in with Faye, and we bought a small house together. I reconnected with my sister who had built a successful life without any family support. I learned that money from my father would have come with strings attached forever, and I was better off earning my own. My father didn't speak to me for 2 years. He told relatives I had chosen a construction worker over my own family. He told his friends I had thrown away my future for someone beneath me. He painted himself as the victim of an ungrateful son who didn't appreciate sacrifice. Then his health started declining. The phone rang at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. I was already in bed reading while Faye worked on furniture designs at her desk in the corner. I almost didn't answer because unknown numbers that late usually meant spam, but something made me pick up. My uncle Marcus's voice came through shaky and rushed. He said my father collapsed in his bathroom that evening. He said the paramedics took him to Memorial Hospital. He said it was his heart, and it looked bad. I grabbed a pen from the nightstand with hands that wouldn't stay steady. I wrote the room number on the back of an envelope while Marcus kept talking about cardiac failure and emergency treatment. Faye looked up from her sketches when she heard my voice change. She stood and came over before I even finished the call. She said she would drive me there right now if I wanted to go. I nodded because I couldn't make words come out properly. We got dressed in silence. Faye found my shoes while I stared at the room number I'd written. The drive took 20 minutes through empty empty streets. Faye didn't ask if I was okay because she knew I wasn't. She just drove and kept one hand on my knee whenever she wasn't shifting gears. The hospital parking garage smelled like oil and antiseptic. We took the elevator to the 4th floor. The fluorescent lights in the cardiac unit made everything look too bright and too cold at the same time. A nurse at the desk pointed down the hall when I gave my father's name. Room 4C was the 3rd door on the left. I stopped walking about 15 feet away from it. Faye stopped with me. I could see through the small window in the door. My father lay in the bed, hooked up to machines that beeped and hummed. He looked smaller than I remembered. His hair was undone instead of perfectly combed. His face looked gray. He wore a hospital gown instead of the tailored suits he always insisted on. I stood there counting the machines around his bed. Faye touched my shoulder gently. She asked if I needed more time. I shook my head and made myself walk forward. My hand reached for the door handle. I pushed it open. The room smelled like hand sanitizer and that specific hospital smell that's impossible to describe. My father's eyes were closed. Then they opened. He turned his head on the pillow and saw me standing in the doorway. His eyes got wide. He looked genuinely shocked that I was actually there. I walked closer to the bed. Faye stayed near the door to give us space. My father opened his mouth and the first words out were asking where I'd been for 2 years. Not hello, not thank you for coming. Just an accusation wrapped up as a question, like he hadn't been the one who cut me off completely, like I was the one who disappeared. I felt my jaw tighten, but I kept my voice level. I said I was here now to see how he was doing. I asked what the doctors told him. He stared at me for a long moment. I could see him deciding whether to push the guilt trip further or accept what I was offering. He chose to let it go for now. He said his heart was failing. He said they caught it before he died, but it was close. A doctor came in about 10 minutes later. She was young with tired eyes and coffee stains on her white coat. She looked at me and asked if I was family. I said I was his son. She nodded and started explaining in terms I barely followed about cardiac function and valve problems and surgical options. She said my father needed surgery within the next few days. She said recovery would take months. She said he would need care and support and probably couldn't live alone for a while. I asked about success rates. I asked about risks. I asked practical questions while my father watched me from the bed. I could feel him looking for signs of either total devotion or complete abandonment. I gave him neither. I just listened to the doctor and took notes on my phone. Faye drove me home around 2 a.m. I called my boss from the car and left a message saying I'd be late to work. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling while Faye breathed softly beside me. The next week turned into a blur of hospital visits squeezed between work obligations. I went Tuesday evening after finishing a deposition. I went Thursday during my lunch break and ate a sandwich in the parking garage afterward. My father acted grateful but also wounded, like I should be there more, like I should drop everything and camp out in his room. Faye noticed I came home tense and quiet after each visit. She found me Saturday morning staring at my coffee without drinking it. She sat down across from me at our small kitchen table. She said she was worried about me. She said I seemed exhausted and anxious all the time now. She said I needed to figure out what level of involvement I could actually handle before this consumed me. Her words made sense, but I didn't know how to answer. My sister Juliet called me the following Monday. I was at work reviewing contracts when my phone buzzed with her number. We hadn't talked in a few months. She said she heard through family gossip that our father was in the hospital. She asked how bad it was. I told her everything the doctor said. We ended up talking for 2 hours. We shared stories about our father's patterns. We realized we both felt the same confusing mix of concern and resentment. She felt guilty for being relieved she lived across the country. I felt guilty for only visiting twice a week. Talking to her helped more than I expected. It made me feel less alone in having complicated feelings about our father almost dying. I went back to the hospital Wednesday evening. I walked down the familiar hallway toward room 4C. A woman in an expensive coat stepped out from the waiting area near the elevators. I recognized her as Alexis, one of my father's oldest friends. She said my name and walked toward me with purpose. She said we needed to talk. She backed me into a corner near the vending machines. She said I needed to forgive and forget because family was everything. She said my father was sick and scared. She said this was my chance to fix our relationship. She said blood was thicker than water and I was being stubborn. I kept my voice polite but firm. I said she didn't know the full story. I said I was doing what I could manage. I said this was between my father and me. She looked disappointed, like she expected me to break down and promised to be the perfect son. I walked past her to my father's room. He was sitting up in bed picking at a dinner tray. I pulled a chair close and asked how he was feeling. He said he was tired. He said the surgery was scheduled for Friday morning. Then he started talking in that careful voice he used when he wanted something. He said he'd been thinking. He said he handled things badly 2 years ago. He said he was sorry I felt hurt by his decisions. I felt something cold settle in my chest. The non-apology was so obvious it almost made me laugh. Sorry I felt hurt. Not sorry for what he did. Sorry I had feelings about it, like my reaction was the problem instead of his actions. I felt the small hope I'd been carrying deflate. He still didn't understand what he did wrong. He couldn't take real responsibility. I said I appreciated him trying. I didn't say anything else. The attorney called Thursday morning while I was in a meeting with a client. I saw Gail Farmer's name on my phone screen and stepped out to take take it. She said she was my father's estate attorney. She said my father asked her to contact me about updating his will. She said he wanted to make changes now that he was facing his mortality. I felt anger rise hot and sharp. Even from a hospital bed facing surgery, he was using his will as a tool. He couldn't just be sick. He couldn't just let me help without turning it into a transaction. I told Gail I didn't want to discuss his will while he was sick. I said it felt wrong to talk about inheritance when he might die on an operating table. She said she understood, but she was following his instructions. I hung up and stood in the hallway outside the conference room trying to breathe normally. Work got harder to focus on. I sat in client meetings and realized I hadn't heard the last 5 minutes of conversation. I reviewed documents and had to reread the same paragraph 4 times. My boss noticed during an important meeting with a potential client. I blanked on a simple question about timeline. He covered for me smoothly but pulled me aside afterward. He asked if everything was okay. I said I had some family stuff going on. He said to let him know if I needed time off. I realized I needed to set clearer boundaries before this crisis ate my whole life. I couldn't be the son my father wanted and also be the lawyer my firm needed. I had to choose what I could actually give and accept that it wouldn't be enough for everyone. I came home that evening and Faye was in the kitchen making dinner. She asked how my day was and I said fine. She mentioned she'd picked up groceries and noticed we were low on coffee. I snapped at her about leaving the grocery bags on the counter instead of putting things away immediately. She stopped chopping vegetables and looked at me. The kitchen got quiet except for something simmering on the stove. She said I'd been on edge for days and she was worried about me. I told her I was handling it. She put down the knife and said I wasn't handling it. I was letting it consume me. She said she watched me turn into someone else every time I came back from the hospital. She said my father spent years controlling me with money, and now he was controlling me with guilt, and I was letting it happen all over again. She said she worried I was losing myself trying to be the perfect son for someone who never treated me well. Her words landed hard because they were true. I'd been so focused on doing the right thing that I forgot to protect myself from falling back into old patterns. I apologized for snapping at her. She came over and hugged me and said we needed to figure out what I could actually give without destroying myself in the process. Juliet called 2 days later saying she'd booked a flight. She arrived on a Thursday afternoon and we drove straight to the hospital. I felt nervous about bringing her because my father hadn't seen her in over 5 years. We rode the elevator up to his floor without talking much. When we walked into his room together, my father's face went through several expressions in quick succession. Surprise first, then something that looked like fear, then something softer I couldn't quite name. He stared at both of us standing there, his 2 rejected children in one room. Juliet said hello and asked how he was feeling. He said he was tired but recovering. The 3 of us sat in awkward silence for a few minutes. Then my father started crying quietly. He said he never thought he'd see both of us together again. He said he'd made terrible choices and pushed away the people who mattered most. Juliet and I exchanged glances. It wasn't a full apology, but it was closer than anything he'd said before. We stayed for an hour and talked about neutral things like the weather and the hospital food. When we left, Juliet said that was harder than she expected, but also better somehow. My uncle Marcus caught me in the hospital parking lot the next day. He'd been visiting my father and saw me walking to my car. He asked if we could talk for a minute. We sat on a bench outside the main entrance. Marcus said my father had been talking to him about how lonely the past 2 years had been. He said my father missed me and Juliet more than he'd admit to us directly. He said our father was too proud to say he was wrong, but clearly felt bad about losing his children over money and control. Marcus said he'd watched my father look at old photos and cry when he thought no one was watching. I felt something shift in my chest. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was understanding that my father was suffering too. Marcus said he wasn't making excuses for what my father did, just wanted me to know that my father did have regrets, even if he couldn't say it properly. I thanked Marcus for telling me. He hugged me and said family was complicated, but worth fighting for when possible. 3 days after his surgery, my father had a setback. His heart rate dropped and the monitors started beeping. Nurses rushed in and pushed me out of the room. I stood in the hallway watching through the window as they worked on him. A doctor came out 20 minutes later and said he'd stabilized, but it had been close. She said the next 24 hours were critical. I called Juliet and Faye, and then I went back into his room. My father looked so small in the hospital bed with all the tubes and wires. I sat down and took his hand carefully. It felt thin and cold. He squeezed back weakly without opening his eyes. We sat like that for hours. I didn't say anything and neither did he, but something changed between us in that silence. I realized I didn't want him to die with all this anger and distance between us. I wanted him to know I loved him, even though he'd hurt me. I wanted to find some kind of peace before it was too late. When my father finally stabilized and woke up properly, he seemed different, softer somehow. He asked me about my life with Faye in a way that sounded actually curious instead of judgmental. I told him about our house and how Faye had built most of our furniture by hand. I described the dining table she'd made from reclaimed wood and the bookshelves she'd designed for my law books. He listened without interrupting or criticizing. He asked what kind of work Faye was doing now. I explained she'd gotten a contract making custom pieces for a new hotel downtown. He said that sounded like good work. The conversation felt strange and fragile, like we were both trying hard not to break whatever small connection we'd found. I left that day feeling something I hadn't felt about my father in years. Hope, maybe, or at least possibility. The next week, I ran into my father's nurse in the hallway. His name was Nathan, and he'd been taking care of my father since the surgery. Nathan stopped me and said he wanted to tell me something. He said my father talked about me all the time. He said there was a photo of me on the bedside table that my father looked at constantly. I was surprised because my father never showed that kind of open affection before. Nathan said my father had mentioned several times how much he missed having me in his life. He said my father seemed to regret a lot of his past choices. I thanked Nathan for telling me. It made me wonder if being sick had changed my father's view on what actually mattered. Maybe facing death made him realize that money and control meant nothing compared to having people who loved you. 2 weeks after the surgery, my father asked if we could talk seriously. I pulled my chair close to his bed. He said he'd been thinking a lot while lying there recovering. He said he was wrong to try to control my life the way he did. He said he did it because he wanted me to be secure and comfortable. He said he grew up with nothing and spent his whole life afraid of being poor again. He said he thought money could protect me from suffering. I told him that real security comes from being loved for who you are, not what you do or who you marry. I said feeling controlled and conditional wasn't security at all. My father started crying. It was the first time I could remember seeing him actually cry with real emotion instead of angry tears. He said he understood that now, but wished he'd understood it sooner. He said he wasted so many years being afraid and trying to control things that didn't need controlling. I reached over and held his hand while he cried. A few days later, my father said he wanted to meet Faye properly, not just see her in passing, but actually talk to her and get to know her. I felt nervous about it, but agreed. I brought Faye to the hospital that weekend. My father was sitting up in bed looking more alert than he had in weeks. He shook Faye's hand and thanked her for coming. Then he started asking her questions about her work and her family and how we met. Faye answered everything honestly and patiently. She talked about learning carpentry from her grandmother and why she loved working with wood. She talked about meeting me in the coffee shop and knowing immediately that she wanted to get to know me better. My father asked pointed questions about her business and her plans for the future. Faye didn't get defensive or try to impress him. She just told the truth about loving her work and loving me and building a good life together. I watched my father's face while she talked and saw him really listening for the first time. After Faye left, my father was quiet for a while. Then he said he could see why I chose her. He said she clearly loved me and treated me well. He said she seemed like a good woman who made me happy. It wasn't a full apology for everything he'd put me through. It wasn't even close to making up for the years of control and threats, but it was something. It was him acknowledging that my choice was valid and that I knew what was right for my own life. That meant more than I expected it to. Gail called me the following week. She said my father had given her new instructions about his will. She said he wanted to restore me as a beneficiary. I went to the hospital and asked my father about it directly. He said he wanted to do right by me while he still could. I told him I didn't want his money if it came with conditions or expectations. I said I'd built a life without it and I was fine. He said there were no conditions this time. He said he just wanted to know I'd be taken care of if something happened to him. He said it wasn't about control anymore. It was about love. I didn't know if I believed that completely, but I could see he was trying. I coordinated with Juliet about taking my father to his follow-up appointment the next week. We met at the hospital entrance and walked together to the cardiology wing where they'd scheduled his checkup. My father sat between us in the waiting room and reached for both our hands at the same time. His fingers felt thin and cold, but his grip was firm. He looked at me first, then at Juliet, and his eyes filled with tears. He said he'd been thinking a lot during his recovery about all the years he wasted trying to control us instead of just loving us. He said he could have been enjoying having us in his life this whole time, but he was too busy being proud and stubborn. He said he finally understood what he lost when he cut us off, and he was sorry it took almost dying for him to figure it out. Juliet squeezed his hand, and I felt my throat get tight. The nurse called his name, and we all stood up together. After the appointment showed good progress, I suggested we plan a family dinner at our house. My father looked surprised, but agreed immediately. Faye and I spent the weekend getting ready for the dinner. She cleaned the house while I cooked, and we both felt nervous about having my father in our space for the first time. Juliet arrived first with a bottle of wine. Then Uncle Marcus showed up with flowers, and finally my father came carrying a store-bought dessert. I watched him walk through our small living room and look at everything. He stopped at the dining table Faye had built and ran his hand across the smooth wood surface. He asked Faye how long it took to make, and she explained the process of selecting the wood and joining the pieces. He listened carefully and said it was beautiful work, and he could tell she put real care into it. Faye looked pleased and a little shocked. We sat down to eat, and the conversation stayed light at first. Marcus told stories about family members, and Juliet talked about her work. My father asked Faye questions about her business and actually seemed interested in her answers. He complimented the food and thanked me for hosting. At one point, I looked around the table and realized this was exactly the kind of family gathering I'd always wanted, but never thought we could have. Everyone was relaxed and genuine, and nobody was performing for anyone else. After dinner, we moved to the living room and talked for another hour before people started leaving. My father hugged me at the door and thanked me again for including him. 3 months passed, and my father continued recovering well. We established a routine of talking on the phone every week and having dinner once a month. The first time I had to say no to one of his requests, I braced myself for a fight. He'd asked me to attend a charity event with him on a night I already had plans with Faye. I explained I couldn't make it and waited for him to push back or guilt me. Instead, he just said okay and asked if we could do lunch the following week instead. That moment proved to me he was actually capable of respecting boundaries when he chose to. Our relationship wasn't perfect and probably never would be. He still made comments sometimes that showed his old way of thinking, but when I called him on it, he apologized and tried to do better. He asked about Faye's work and remembered details from our conversations. He reached out to Juliet regularly and made an effort to repair that relationship too. The change wasn't dramatic or complete, but it was real and consistent. I started to believe this new version of our relationship might actually last. I sat in our living room one evening with Faye looking through photos on my phone from the family dinner. She pointed at one of my father laughing at something Juliet said and mentioned how different he looked compared to the stern man in the hospital months ago. I scrolled through more pictures and realized something important. I'd spent years thinking the only way to win with my father was to either submit completely or cut him off entirely. But I'd found a third option that I never knew existed. I got my family back, but on terms that felt honest and healthy instead of manipulative and conditional. My father would never be the warm, unconditionally loving parent I wished I'd had growing up. He would always have that controlling streak and that need to manage situations, but he was trying now in ways he never did before, and that effort meant something real. I'd learned that sometimes good enough is actually enough, and that imperfect relationships can still be valuable if both people are willing to work at them. Faye put her arm around me and asked what I was thinking about. I told her I was just grateful for how things turned out, and I meant it.